John shifted in his seat, his eyes glued to the winding road ahead. The rain was relentless, hammering against the windshield, the wipers working overtime to keep the path visible. He had been driving for hours, the weight of exhaustion heavy on his chest. The isolation of the highway seemed to stretch infinitely into the darkness, the headlights barely piercing through the downpour. This wasn't his usual route, but after the last-minute change in delivery plans, he had no choice. His thoughts drifted to his family, his ex-wife, his 2 kids, the life he had left behind. Regret clung to him like the thick mist that had started to rise from the asphalt. He hadn't seen his children in months, and the occasional phone calls didn't make up for his absence. It was easier to keep driving, pushing the guilt deeper down, hidden under the hum of the engine. Out of the corner of his eye, John spotted a figure standing by the side of the road. He hit the brakes instinctively, squinting through the rain. A man was standing there, drenched, with his thumb out in the universal gesture of someone in need of a ride. John hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He never picked up hitchhikers. It was too risky, but the storm was brutal, and something about the figure's stillness in the face of it all felt off. After a moment of internal debate, John sighed and pulled over. The man walked toward the truck, his footsteps splashing through puddles. John unlocked the passenger door, and the stranger climbed in without a word. He was tall, with an angular face and dark hair that clung to his forehead in wet strands. His clothes were soaked through, but he didn't seem to care. For the first few minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and the rumble of the engine. John glanced over at the man, expecting him to introduce himself or at least offer a thank you, but the hitchhiker remained silent, staring straight ahead as if lost in thought. Finally, John cleared his throat. "Rough night, huh?" The man turned to him slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You could say that." John waited for more, but the hitchhiker returned to his silent contemplation. The tension in the cab grew thick, the air heavy with unspoken words. John shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the stranger's presence. He tried to focus on the road, but something about the man's demeanor gnawed at the edges of his mind. As the miles rolled by, the hitchhiker began to speak again, his voice low and calm. "Long way from home, aren't you, John?" John's grip on the wheel tightened. He hadn't told the man his name. His chest tightened with unease, but he forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the creeping dread. "Lucky guess." The hitchhiker didn't respond, just gave him a small smile, as if he knew something John didn't. The silence in the truck was becoming unbearable. John's mind raced with questions, but he didn't dare ask. He glanced over at the hitchhiker, his unease growing with each passing minute. The rain outside intensified, creating a constant drumbeat against the roof, but inside the truck, it was eerily quiet. The stranger's presence was oppressive, like a shadow that wouldn't lift. The man suddenly broke the silence. "You know, sometimes the road takes us places we don't expect." John's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The hitchhiker turned his head slowly to face him. His eyes seemed darker now, almost black. "This road you're on, it's not the one you think it is." John's heart skipped a beat, and he glanced nervously at the man. The comment was strange, unsettling, but he tried to brush it off. "I've driven this route 100 times. The man chuckled softly, the sound low and sinister. "Have you?" John felt a chill crawl up his spine. Something wasn't right. The stranger wasn't just talking about the physical road. There was something else, and something deeper. The man's words seemed to suggest that John wasn't just lost geographically, but in some other way. Something existential, perhaps. John tried to shake the feeling, but the stranger's smile lingered in his mind. It was a knowing smile, the kind that hinted at secrets. He needed to get out of this situation, but the storm made it impossible to just drop the man off anywhere. He forced a laugh, hoping to ease the tension. "What are you, some kind of philosopher?" The hitchhiker's expression didn't change. "You could say that." The road ahead was swallowed by darkness, the headlights doing little to illuminate the path. It felt like they were driving deeper into the void, away from civilization, from safety. John gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "Tell me, John," the hitchhiker said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Why did you leave them?" John's blood ran cold. "Leave who?" "Your kids," the hitchhiker said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Your family. Why did you abandon them?" John's heart pounded in his chest. How could this man know about his family? He hadn't mentioned them. He hadn't said anything personal. His mind raced, trying to figure out how the stranger could possibly know about his past. "I didn't abandon them," John muttered, though the words felt hollow. The hitchhiker's dark eyes bore into him. "Didn't you?" John's jaw clenched. His past was none of this man's business. He didn't owe him an explanation. He tried to focus on the road, but the hitchhiker's presence was suffocating, filling the cab with an oppressive weight. His thoughts swirled in confusion and guilt. How did this man know so much about him? As if sensing John's rising panic, the hitchhiker leaned closer. "The road has a funny way of bringing things back around, doesn't it? No matter how far you drive, you can't outrun the past." John's hands trembled on the wheel. He couldn't take it anymore. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaky with fear. The hitchhiker's smile widened, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "I'm just a passenger, John, same as you." John's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of the hitchhiker's words settled over him. The rain outside was relentless, pounding on the windshield as the truck crawled along the dark road. The world seemed to close in, with the night swallowing everything beyond the beams of the headlights. He tried to calm his racing thoughts, gripping the steering wheel as if it could anchor him to reality. The hitchhiker had gone silent again, staring out the window as though nothing had happened, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding. "You didn't answer my question," John said, his voice barely steady. The hitchhiker didn't turn to face him this time. "Which one?" "Who are you?" John asked again, his eyes darting between the road and the man beside him. "How do you know about my family?" The stranger let out a low chuckle. "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters," John snapped. His voice cracked, revealing the fear gnawing at him. "You don't just get in someone's truck and start talking like you know them." The hitchhiker finally turned to him, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the cab. "I know more than you think, John." John's knuckles tightened on the wheel. "How?" For a moment, the only sound was the rain, beating against the truck like a heartbeat. Then, the hitchhiker spoke, his voice soft and almost regretful. "Because I've been down this road before." John's stomach twisted. He wanted to demand more answers, to stop the truck and kick this man out, but something told him that wouldn't work. There was an air of inevitability about the hitchhiker, as though no matter what John did, this was a journey they were both bound to take. Ahead, the road twisted sharply, and John had to focus to keep the truck from skidding. The rain was coming down so hard now that it was almost impossible to see. He slowed the vehicle, squinting through the blurry windshield. "You should pay attention," the hitchhiker said, his tone suddenly cold. "The road's getting narrower." John's heart raced as he glanced ahead. The road did seem to be changing. The trees on either side were pressing closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The asphalt beneath the tires felt uneven, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath them. "I don't remember this part," John muttered under his breath. The hitchhiker smiled that same eerie smile. "That's because you weren't meant to." John's mind reeled. He wanted to turn the truck around to escape this nightmare, but there was no room to turn on the narrowing road. Panic set in, and he could feel the walls of his mind closing in, just like the trees outside. The weight of everything, the hitchhiker, the storm, the oppressive sense of dread, was becoming unbearable. "What do you mean?" John asked, his voice shaking. The hitchhiker's gaze never left the road. "Some roads only appear when you're ready to face what's at the end of them." John's pulse pounded in his ears. "What the hell are you talking about?" Without answering, the hitchhiker reached out and turned the radio on. Static filled the truck, broken only by faint, distorted voices that seemed to whisper from the other side of the static. John's hands trembled on the wheel as the sound crawled into his mind, twisting and distorting the space around him. He slammed the radio off and his breath ragged. "Stop playing games with me." But the hitchhiker's face was still blank, emotionless. "It's not a game, John. You know what's at the end of this road." John swallowed hard, shaking his head. No, I don't. The hitchhiker's eyes gleamed darkly. You will. As they rounded another bend, something came into view on the side of the road. It was barely visible in the downpour, but John could make out the shape of a car, an old, rusted vehicle sitting abandoned in the dirt. His heart skipped a beat. That's not real, John whispered, his eyes wide as he passed the car. The same car his wife had driven when she left him, disappearing into the night with their kids. The hitchhiker leaned forward, peering out the windshield. Oh, it's real! John's hands trembled on the wheel as they passed the rusted car, his mind racing. He couldn't tear his eyes away from it, the familiar shape now haunting him in the shadows. It was impossible. His wife had taken that car years ago, and yet here it was, abandoned on this dark, desolate road. How? How is that here? John's voice was barely above a whisper. The hitchhiker's cold eyes never left the road. You're starting to understand, aren't you? John shook his head, trying to clear the fog of confusion and fear that was slowly suffocating him. No, I don't understand. None of this makes sense. The hitchhiker sighed, as if he was disappointed in John's inability to grasp the situation. You've spent years trying to bury the truth, running from it, but it always catches up with you. John clenched his teeth. What truth? What the hell are you talking about? The hitchhiker's gaze shifted, his expression unreadable. The truth about what happened to your family, John. The truck slowed as John's grip on the wheel faltered. His chest tightened, and the memories he had fought so hard to suppress came flooding back. His wife's face, their children's laughter, the night they left him, disappearing into the storm. He had convinced himself that they had simply moved on, that life had taken them in another direction. But deep down, he had always felt there was something more, something he didn't want to confront. No, John whispered, shaking his head in denial. It's not my fault. The hitchhiker's voice was soft but unrelenting. Isn't it? John's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of guilt and fear pressing down on him. He had never allowed himself to think about that night for too long, had pushed the pain away, buried it beneath layers of excuses and distractions. But here, on this road, there was no escaping it. The past was clawing its way back, forcing him to face it. You could have stopped them, the hitchhiker continued, his tone cutting through the rain-soaked air. You could have gone after them, but you didn't. John's breath hitched as the truth began to crack through the walls he had built around his memories. He had let them go that night. He had watched as his wife and children drove away, too consumed by his own pride and anger to chase after them, to make things right. And now, that decision was coming back to haunt him in the most literal way. They're gone, John muttered, his voice hollow. There's nothing I can do now. The hitchhiker's eyes flickered with something, pity, perhaps, or maybe it was just the reflection of the headlights in the rain. There's always something you can do, John, but first you have to face it. The truck slowed to a crawl as John's mind raced. The road ahead was barely visible through the torrential rain, but he knew he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back. The hitchhiker was right. He had been running for too long, and now the past had caught up with him. As they drove further into the storm, the road seemed to change. The trees lining the sides became darker, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers trying to pull him deeper into the nightmare. The air grew colder, and the sound of the rain was no longer the only thing he could hear. There were whispers. At first, they were faint, barely audible beneath the roar of the storm. But as they moved forward, the voices grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from the trees, from the shadows that moved in the corner of John's vision. "Do you hear them?" the hitchhiker asked, his voice almost drowned out by the rain. John's throat tightened. What is that?" "The past, John. The things you've tried to forget. They're waiting for you." John gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He could feel the weight of the hitchhiker's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. The whispers were growing louder, more distinct, and then he heard it, one voice, clear as day, cutting through the storm. "Daddy!" John's heart stopped. His blood ran cold as he recognized the voice. It was his daughter. "No!" John whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "No, this can't be happening." The hitchhiker didn't say anything, but John could feel his gaze on him, waiting for him to acknowledge the truth he had buried so deep that even now, standing on the edge of the abyss, he couldn't bring himself to face it. But the whispers didn't stop. They surrounded him, pulling him deeper into the darkness, and in the distance, through the rain and the shadows, John saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the road, a small figure. John slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the wet pavement as it came to a screeching halt. His heart raced as he stared at the figure ahead, barely illuminated by the headlights. It was his daughter. The truck came to a jarring stop, the sound of the brakes cutting through the relentless downpour. John's chest heaved as he gripped the steering wheel, staring in disbelief at the small figure standing in the road. The rain blurred the edges of her form, but there was no mistaking it. It was his daughter, Emily. She stood motionless, drenched from the rain, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stared straight ahead, through him almost, as if she wasn't truly there. John felt his breath catch in his throat, his mind screaming that this couldn't be real. "Emily?" His voice cracked as he called her name, but she didn't respond. She didn't move. She just stood there, like a ghost frozen in time. "Go to her," the hitchhiker whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "You need to face this." John's heart pounded in his chest. His instincts told him to run, to stay in the truck and drive away as fast as he could. But something inside him, some deep, primal part of him, knew that the hitchhiker was right. He had to confront this nightmare. He had to face what he had buried for so long. With trembling hands, John slowly opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like icy needles, soaking through his clothes in seconds, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the small figure standing in the road. "Emily?" he called again, his voice shaking as he took a step closer. Is it really you?" She didn't answer. The only sound was the rain pounding against the asphalt and the steady hum of the truck's engine behind him. But as John approached, he noticed something. Her lips were moving. Barely, but they were. She was whispering something. John's pulse raced as he stepped closer, straining to hear her over the storm. "Emily, what are you saying?" And then he heard it, soft, faint, but unmistakable. She was whispering the same word, over and over again. "Daddy, Daddy." John's legs felt like they would give out beneath him. He staggered forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily, please." But as he reached out to her, something changed. The figure in front of him flickered, like a candle caught in the wind. For a moment she wasn't there, and then she was back, solid and real, but different. Her face, her once innocent, beautiful face, was twisted now, contorted with pain and anger. Her eyes were dark, hollow pits, and her mouth was curled into a snarl. "Daddy!" she shrieked, her voice no longer the soft whisper of his little girl, but a guttural, angry scream. John stumbled backward, his heart pounding with terror. This wasn't his daughter, this thing, whatever it was, it couldn't be her. The hitchhiker's voice came from behind him, calm and cold. "She's not real, John. None of this is—" John turned, his mind spinning. "What do you mean?" The hitchhiker stepped out of the truck, walking slowly toward him. His face was expressionless, as if the scene unfolding before them didn't affect him at all. "This is the truth you've been running from, the guilt you've buried. It's time to face it." John's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned back toward the figure of his daughter, still standing in the rain, her distorted face staring back at him. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an eerie silence. "What is this?" John demanded, his voice barely steady. "What's happening to me?" The hitchhiker stopped beside him, his hands in his pockets. "It's not just you, this road, this place. It shows you what you fear most, what you can't escape." John's mind reeled. The road, the car, his daughter. It all swirled together in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. But even as the terror threatened to consume him, a part of him began to understand. This road, "It's not real, is it?" John asked, his voice hollow. "None of this is—" The hitchhiker's cold eyes met his. "The road is real, John. But what you see on it, that's something else." John's heart pounded as the realization hit him. He wasn't just lost on some back road in the middle of the storm. He was trapped in his own guilt, his own regret, forced to confront the thing he had spent years trying to forget. The hitchhiker stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "You let them go that night, didn't you? You could have stopped them, but you didn't." John's breath hitched, his hands shaking at his sides. I didn't mean for them to—" The hitchhiker's voice was relentless. "But they did, and now you have to live with that." John's vision blurred as the rain pounded down on him. He fell to his knees, the weight of his guilt crushing him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The figure of his daughter flickered again, her face softening for a brief moment before vanishing entirely. The road was empty once more, the rain falling in a steady rhythm around him. John's shoulders shook with silent sobs as the hitchhiker stood over him. "It's time to let go, John," he said quietly. "You can't run forever." John closed his eyes, the truth finally sinking in. He had spent years trying to escape his guilt, but now on this endless road, there was no more running. "I let them go," John whispered, the words heavy with pain. "And I've been lost ever since." The hitchhiker knelt beside him, his cold hand resting on John's shoulder. "But now, you've found your way." John opened his eyes, the storm still raging around them, but for the first time, he felt something shift inside him. The guilt, the regret. It was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He wasn't lost anymore. John sat on his knees in the middle of the rain-soaked road, the storm continuing to rage around him. The hitchhiker stood beside him, silent, as if waiting for something. The figure of his daughter had disappeared, leaving only the echo of her haunting voice in his mind. For a moment, John allowed himself to breathe, the overwhelming guilt that had consumed him for years, slowly beginning to loosen its grip. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't over yet. There was still something he needed to confront, something far darker, far more dangerous. He rose to his feet, his legs shaky, and turned to face the hitchhiker. "Is this it?" John asked, his voice hoarse. "Is this what the road wanted me to see?" The hitchhiker met his gaze, his eyes cold and distant. "You've only faced part of it. There's still more. The road doesn't just show you your guilt. It shows you what you fear most." John felt a chill run down his spine, even through the pounding rain. "What do you mean?" Before the hitchhiker could answer, the sound of tires screeching in the distance echoed through the storm. John's head snapped toward the sound, his pulse quickening. There in the distance, a pair of headlights appeared, cutting through the darkness. The car was coming fast, too fast. It was heading straight for them. John's heart raced as he instinctively stepped back, his mind spinning. It couldn't be. It was just like that night. The hitchhiker remained calm, watching the approaching car with an expression of indifference. "You know what's coming, don't you?" John's breath caught in his throat as the car grew closer, the headlights blinding in the rain. He recognized the sound of the engine, the way the tires screeched on the wet road. It was all too familiar. "No," John whispered, his voice barely audible. "It can't be." But it was. The car that had haunted his nightmares for years, the car that had taken everything from him, was barreling down the road toward him once again. He could see it now, his old sedan, the one he had driven that fateful night. The same night he had let his wife and daughter drive away without him, not knowing it would be the last time he saw them alive. The car was coming fast, too fast to stop, and it was heading straight for him. John froze, his mind screaming at him to move, to get out of the way, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed by the memory, by the crushing guilt that had defined his life ever since. "John!" The hitchhiker's voice cut through the storm like a knife. "You need to face it!" John turned to the hitchhiker, his heart pounding in his chest. "Face what? I can't stop it. It's too late." The hitchhiker's cold eyes locked onto John's. "It's not too late. You can still choose." You've always had the choice. The car was almost upon them now, the roar of the engine deafening. John's entire body trembled as he faced the oncoming vehicle. His mind flashed back to that night, to the argument with his wife, to the way he had let her drive off in anger. He had made a choice that night to let them go, and it had cost him everything. But now, standing on this cursed road, with the past barreling toward him once again, he realized something. He had another choice to make. This time he wouldn't run. This time he wouldn't let it end the same way. With a surge of adrenaline, John forced his legs to move. He stepped forward, directly into the path of the oncoming car. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. He had to confront it. He had to face what he had avoided for so long. The headlights blinded him, the roar of the engine filling his ears. The car was seconds away from hitting him, but John didn't flinch. And then, just as the car was about to make impact, everything stopped. The headlights blinked out. The roar of the engine fell silent. The car vanished into thin air, leaving only the rain and the empty road behind. John stood there, breathing heavily, his body trembling. He had done it. He had faced his greatest fear, the moment that had defined his life for so long, and for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Relief. The hitchhiker stepped forward, his voice calm and quiet. "You've faced it, John. You finally let it go." John turned to him, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and peace. "Is it over?" The hitchhiker nodded slowly. "It's over. You're free now." John closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him. The weight that had hung over him for years, the guilt, the regret, it was gone. He had faced his past, and he had survived. When he opened his eyes again, the hitchhiker was gone. The road was empty, the rain falling gently now, as if the storm had passed. John stood there for a moment, breathing in the fresh air, feeling the peace that had eluded him for so long. He was free, finally free. He turned back to the truck, his mind clear for the first time in years. He knew what he had to do now. It was time to go home. With a deep breath, John climbed back into the truck, started the engine tab and pulled back onto the road. The rain continued to fall, but it didn't bother him anymore. He drove forward, leaving the haunted road behind him, ready to start a new chapter of his life. For the first time in a long time, John wasn't running from his past. He was driving toward his future. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.